Welcome, fellow Earthlings, to the In Tune to Nature radio program on Radio Free Georgia, an eco and animal protection radio show that aims to improve your environmental literacy to make you a more inspired and informed eco-citizen and responsible human-animal Earthling. I'm host Carrie Freeman. The views and opinions I and others express on In Tune to Nature do not necessarily reflect those of WRFG, its board, staff, or volunteers. We're a progressive, indie, non-commercial station run largely by volunteers like myself, and thus we appreciate and need your support by telling your friends how cool Radio Free Georgia is. They can listen on the WRFG app on their phone, and by making donations at wrfg.org like I do. You can find podcasts of In Tune to Nature by subscribing on your favorite streaming sites or at our show website, facebook.com/intunetonature. Good stuff ahead. Let's get to the show, folks. I originally recorded this show on the fishing industry and how it affects fish in 2018 with Dr. Jonathan Balcombe. Everything about it actually is pretty timeless, but I do want to say 3 things have changed. One, he has published a new book called Superfly about flies and how amazing they are. And he also lives in Canada now, and we have more than 8 billion people on the planet. So that just makes the whole fishing situation even more perilous for sea animals. So I think you'll enjoy this really interesting broadcast. Tonight we're going to be talking with Jonathan Balcombe, a biologist. We have him here in the studio, and we're going to be talking about fishing. And from the not just fishing practices, but also what are the fish experiencing from these fishing practices. Let me tell you a little bit about our guest. Dr. Balcombe, Jonathan, was born in England, raised in New Zealand and Canada, and has lived in the United States since 1987. He's a biologist with a PhD in ethology, which is the study of animal behavior. He's the author of 4 popular science books on the inner lives of animals, including Pleasurable Kingdom, Second Nature, and What a Fish Knows, which was a New York Times bestseller. He's published over 60 scientific papers and book chapters on animal behavior and animal protection. Formerly Department Chair for Animal Studies with the Humane Society University and Director of Animal Sentience with the Humane Society Institute for Science and Policy, Jonathan works as an independent author and performs editing services for aspiring and established authors. He also serves as an associate editor for the journal Animal Sentience, and he teaches a course in animal sentience for the Viridis Graduate Institute. A popular speaker, Jonathan has lectured on 6 continents. He says the penguins eagerly anticipate his arrival in Antarctica, so if you know anybody down there is looking for a speaker, he's interested. Jonathan currently lives in South Florida, where in his spare time he enjoys biking, baking, birding, and Bach, and trying to understand the lizards on his patio. Okay, let me turn his microphone up. Welcome, Dr. Balcombe.
Hi, Carrie. Good to be here.
Yeah. It's so nice to have you in the studio today. That's good. So we're going to be talking about your book, What a Fish Knows, but normally most of the people who interview you probably are having you tell all the many interesting stories from the book about the amazing lives and capacities of all different fish species. You tell a lot of fun and compelling stories in the book, and all about the amazing things they can do. But for our environmental show tonight, I thought we'd focus on the last chapter of your book, which is more about what we are doing to them. So that way our radio listeners can consider ways to protect fishes and reduce humanity's destructive practices. And in that last chapter, you mentioned visiting a fish farm where they raise thousands of fish intensively in pens. Tell us what you learned about fish farming. Also, sometimes people call it aquaculture.
Yeah, it's really a fish equivalent of factory farming that we know about on land animals, with cows and pigs and chickens crowded into small spaces, and that's kind of a key aspect of it is the crowded spaces.
Yeah.
It's been estimated that adult salmon who are about a foot long, you can have densities as high as 27 of those fish in an area of the size of a bathtub of water. So crowding, certainly as they get older and bigger, is an issue. And I remember going into that facility, which is a state-of-the-art research facility in West Virginia, and seeing the main tank, which was sort of an observation tank. We could walk up a stairway and look down into it, but you could also look through a window into the dim scene inside. It was fairly dark, very loud. The pumps and machines that run these tanks are pretty loud. And the salmon were all, for the most part, swimming in one direction in a circular motion. And they do change direction every once in a while. I think they change the current or something. I think there's a way they compel the fish to swimming in another direction. But certainly the key thing that you note more than anything else is just the density of the fish in the water. There are individuals who may swim briefly in another direction or jump out of the water. We witnessed all of that. You know, they're all individuals. It's easy to forget that in that situation. But definitely the crowding is the most salient aspect of their lives in that situation.
It must be hard also, particularly with salmon, but really with any fish who are used to having so much freedom and swimming in in so many directions, to be, first of all, crowded in communities that are kind of artificially created, too many fish, and maybe ones that they wouldn't normally be with, and then they don't get to migrate and do all the things that they want.
That's right. Yeah, these are animals who live several years, many years, and they migrate from their natal streams out to the open ocean, where they live for years, and then they return to their natal stream to breed. Is a common misconception that they routinely do that only once, but in fact many are known to swim back into the ocean for another round. But it's a far cry, of course, that natural setting and those natural circumstances from the circumstances they find themselves in aquaculture operations.
Yeah, and some of them are on land. It sounds like what you were looking at was like a tank on land, but then they also have them that are set up with nets or something in bays. Right. Or bays or just off the coast. Or...
Yes, they're typically called sea pens, and they are captive settings that are the fishes are actually in the native waters, not necessarily their own native waters, but certainly natural waters, but they're confined to netted pens. There's a number of problems with that, many of which are not there's certainly welfare problems with the fish are still in those situations, but also ecological problems such as the proliferation of sea lice and other parasites, which are not contained by the pens, needless to say. And a sea louse produces 22,000 eggs in 1 year, and those eggs can drift out into these blooms into the surrounding water, affecting the other fishes passing by. The concentrated wastes from these sea pens is also very high, and there's a biologist in, I think, Norway, who is documenting this to see just how high these concentrations are. So you have the same sorts of problems that you have in factory farm settings on land. You have disease. The risk of disease is much higher because pathogens can spread very quickly among these densely populated populations in small confined spaces, and they can also leach out into the surrounding environment. So you have animal welfare and ecological problems.
Yeah, and what is the lice? What does that do? Is it like when we have lice on our head? Are they just biting them? How do they?
Yes and no. It's actually
involved?
A little bit worse. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's considered to be a very severe welfare issue because these lice, they have chewing mouth parts, and the fishes don't have limbs to push them off.
Yeah.
And I guess they haven't learned the lesson of help the other one, because that would probably help their plight. But in nature, they will solicit louse removal from seagulls and even other cleaner fish and that sort of thing. So they do have some methods in the wild, but in captivity, these lice chew into their bodies, and they can actually chew in through their eyes, through their brains. There's a thing called the death crown, which is the pathology that results from these lice having their way with these fish and chewing in through their heads over time. So it's a pretty awful way to go.
They have wounds on them, basically.
Yes, that's right.
Gross.
They cause wounds if they're untreated. Yeah.
And I know there's an issue ecologically too with with raising fish on land, and then because aren't they being fed fish that are wild caught usually?
It's a good point. It's a common misconception that at least aquaculture puts some relief on the wild fish populations, but the reality is most of the fishes that humans like to eat, salmon, tilapia or tuna, and some of these other fish species that are bred, are very high on the food chain. And they're predatory fishes, and so what do they eat in the wild? They eat other smaller fishes, and that's what's fed to them in these captive settings. And those fish, so-called feed fish, menhadens, sardines, and the like, are caught in the wild. So there's still pressure on wild populations to feed these captive ones. So it doesn't really relieve pressure from wild fish populations.
So it's still, I would consider it unsustainable then in that sense.
Large numbers of humans eating animal products is pretty much
Yeah.
unsustainable now anyway with the modern era, especially with, over 7 billion humans on Earth. Utterly unsustainable. It's a very ecologically and energetically inefficient way to feed humans protein. And we are beginning to discover other ways to do that, but there's a long way to go.
Right. Dr. Balcombe, besides being farmed, another way fish end up being killed and sold for food is being hunted by the commercial fishing industry. Tell us about the concerns you have with the various methods used by the fishing industry to capture and kill fishes in the oceans.
Yeah, it's pretty awful, really, again, from a welfare perspective. I mean, the main methods are purse seining, long lining, and trawling. Those are three prominent methods. And purse seining involves surrounding an identified population of a school of fishes. Could be millions of them, herrings, for instance, and then surrounding them with this net that the boat floats in a circle. And with the modern technology, they can locate these large schools with sonar technology and this sort of thing. Even helicopters go out.
They don't really have a chance.
The fishes don't really have much chance. As I say in my book, it's like bobbing for apples with your hands instead of your mouth.
Yeah.
And so these fishes get surrounded, and the purse is drawn in beneath them. So it's like a purse-shaped net that is then enclosed in, which eventually crushes all the fishes together. And many of them will die of crushing. If they survive the crushing of have the net being hauled out of the water, they're likely to die of suffocation on the boat deck, or possibly bleeding out if they're cut with knives, which is sometimes done with some species. So none of those are very nice ways to go. If it's long lining fishes of various species, in that case, these hooks are indiscriminate, so you get many species of fish, but you also get albatrosses and seabirds get caught by these hooks when they go for the baits.
So explain the long line. Is it this one long fishing line that hangs off the back of a boat or something?
Yeah, it's released off the back of the boat. They can be 60 miles long, so they're super.
60
they can get
miles?
60. Yeah,
oh
they can be super long.
So
and there's hooks at regular intervals. There is a technique of putting pink ribbons, which apparently is a deterrent for albatrosses, but it's not a deterrent for the fishes, and they get caught. Sea turtles also, marine mammals, can get caught up in these. So there's those problems. But if the fish is caught, then it's on this hook for possibly days. It's vulnerable to predation by other fish biting them that they can't really defend themselves against. And then if they're still alive, they're hauled in over long distances onto the boat deck to probably, if they're still alive, they would suffocate on the boat deck. So that's also a pretty horrible way to treat an animal. And then the bottom trawling is the most notorious, really.
Right.
This is where nets are dragged along the bottom, typically a half to a mile deep, and they're on heavy weighted rollers so that it stays along the bottom. It's essentially like bulldozing the bottom of the oceans, and it's completely indiscriminate. Corals
like
that may have taken...
clear-cutting a forest
It's
or
like
something.
It's likened to clear cutting, and structures such as corals and vegetation that have grown there and sort of developed there over decades or possibly even centuries can be destroyed in one pass of one of these nets. And then it scoops up animals. I've seen filmed where they put cameras on these things, and you can see these fishes swimming along the bottom, just trying to stay out of that net and not knowing where to go because these nets are very wide, these trawling nets. And that, too, everything's hauled up on the boat, which leads to another really sad atrocity of commercial fishing, which is bycatch, because a lot of organisms that end up on the boat deck are not so-called target organisms. They're just not desirable, so they're considered waste products, and they're typically thrown back over dead or dying. So it's a very wasteful industry, and it's estimated about 200 million pounds of bycatch are tossed back overboard every day worldwide.
Every day?
Every day, 200 million pounds. So yeah, it's a lot of life lost.
What a waste. Yeah, so every time someone's eating, whether it's a shrimp or any kind of fish, or they call seafood products, there's an unknown number of other individuals who are probably killed to get that one individual
collateral
on the plate.
damage. Yeah, it's good that you mentioned shrimp, because shrimp is one of the worst, because shrimp for bycatch problem, because shrimp live on the bottom, and so the typical methods to catch them involve trawling if it's not a captive setting. So the trawling and that's in some cases, some shrimp fisheries, 90% of the live catch is bycatch.
Yeah.
So about
And that
one.
can include birds and marine mammals
Yes,
as
it
well.
can. There have been some efforts with TED, turtle excluder devices, for instance, which have helped to allow some turtles to get out of the nets.
Yeah.
But inevitably, you still get a lot of collateral damage from those species and others.
Right. And what would death be like for a fish who's hauled up in one of these nets or ends up on a boat? And in terms of, I don't know if science has studied kind of the suffocation or how long that takes for fish to die.
Yeah, depending on the conditions.
Taken out of the water.
Right. It can be minutes to hours. One of the practices is that fishes still living are brought on the boat deck are thrown on ice. And some people have argued that may be a better welfare situation, but in fact, studies find that it's probably worse because it causes the fish to die a lot slower. So they're suffocating over the course of, in some cases, well over an hour. So that's problematic. As for the other ways they die, there's one other we haven't really mentioned yet. We mentioned the crushing in nets and the suffocation on the boat deck and bleeding, but also deep compression, especially for species who swim deeper in the water. So
like from the trawling, that would be one,
trawling
they're
would
on
be
the
an example
bottom,
of that.
and then
Might
they
be
get
a
hauled
problem.
all the way up to the surface very quickly.
That's right. And so the pressure changes, and their bodies are adapted to deep water conditions with high pressure. And bony fishes have a swim bladder. It's a gas-filled sac that is useful for buoyancy control. And as they come up through lower pressure of the shallower water, the swim bladder expands in their bodies, and it causes various internal injuries. Sometimes their esophagus is pushed out of their mouth, their inner organs are crushed. Their eyes can pop out. There's technical terms for all of this stuff, and needless to say, pretty horrible things can happen to them.
Yeah. And we were talking too, there's sometimes where animals would get kind of stabbed to death as well. Were we talking about the tuna when we were discussing that earlier?
Yeah, typically tunas are caught in the wild, out of the wild, and
they're huge fish. I think a
very
lot of
big
us
fish,
don't realize they're huge.
Yeah, there's many
and
species,
fast.
and they range in size, but the largest tuna goes up to 1,500 plus pounds.
Oh my gosh!
And they're very fast swimmers. They're apex predators. And they hunt in groups, and they're impressive, very, very impressive creatures. They're like tigers of the ocean. And the typical methods, and I've seen film of this, is they're caught in purse seines, and they all get concentrated. These huge, powerful, muscular fish end up thrashing around in these nets that are then made smaller and smaller, and they get them more panicked. And the methods that I've seen that they're hauled onto the boat deck is with a gaff, which is a big metal hook. So the fisherman gets within reach of one of these tunas and just gaffs it kind of, I don't know if they aim for a particular part of the body, the head or the body, but they typically just hit the body and stab it essentially. It's like a stabbing.
Yeah.
And then use that gaff to haul it up.
You're getting pulled up by
like
a knife.
Yeah, so it's a traumatic injury.
It's
a traumatic injury then compounded by suffocation and panic and everything else.
Ugh.
So not very nice.
No.
It's all pretty brutal. We don't have the methods that we use to catch fish are developed based on efficiency, not on ethics.
Yeah, that's for sure. And also, there's so much, you mentioned all these nets and lines, but I was reading in your book about how they pollute the oceans too.
Yeah, I mean, so much of our activity is ocean polluting. I mean, pollution of the oceans is one of the many crises facing oceans, and all kinds of ships, be they fishing ships or commercial ships or ocean liners of various sorts. There are efforts to control and contain that, but huge amounts of plastic in particular ends up in the oceans. It's estimated, and fishing leads to a lot of discarded and lost fishing gear. The estimate that I'm aware of was calculated by the World Animal Protection at about 640,000 tons of fishing gear are lost or discarded in the oceans every year. There's an additional tragedy to that, is that a lot of these nets continue to wreak havoc, because they are still effective or partially effective at ensnaring animals, be they fish or sea lions who get them around their necks.
Yeah.
And so bycatch is an ongoing problem with that as well.
So these nets, even when the fishermen and women are not trying to capture the animals anymore, the nets they've discarded are killing. Slowly, probably killing a variety of animals.
That's right, and the animals ensnared in the nets attract other predators who may get ensnared as well, and eventually these nets get weighted down by the dead bodies and they sink to the bottom.
For those just joining us on WRFG's In Tune to Nature radio program, we're speaking with best-selling author and biologist Dr. Jonathan Balcombe, who recently studied the lives of fish for his latest book, What a Fish Knows. Now, many of us have not had that much experience with commercial fishing, but often we do encounter or may have participated in recreational fishing, like catching fish with a fishing pole and a hook in lakes, rivers, and streams. What did you learn about a fish's experiences in terms of them being caught and released? Because a lot of people now are saying, "Oh, but I'm releasing them, so I'm putting them back."
Yeah, recreational fishing is very, very popular sport, particularly here in North America, but also in other parts of the world. And there have been some scientific studies showing that it is actually a significant contributor to impacts on populations, and not to mention individuals of fishes in both freshwater and saltwater habitats. I think the estimate is in the 40 billion range of the number of fishes caught by recreational fishing every year worldwide. So we're talking very, very significant numbers. And sorry, your question
was just kind of about their experience of the fish in the catch and release process too, because a lot of people, minimize that or say, because we all get that if you catch someone and then you're going to actually eat them, that you are killing them. But a lot of other people are like, oh, well, I'm just doing this for fun and I'm putting them back, so it's fine.
Yeah, and it's not totally fine. It's not fine at all. I mean, I guess I'd favor it over lethal use, but. Yeah, I mean, there's a number of injuries that fishes incur when they're caught and released. And obviously, the hooks going into them, often hooks are swallowed, which can be lethal. Whether or not the hook is removed, removal of the hook can be lethal in itself. And then the handling that happens. Responsible fishermen use nets and try to minimize the handling, but there's just only so much you can minimize handling when you're trying to remove a hook from an animal who's panicked and maybe wriggling and this sort of thing. So, I mean, I saw a couple of young sharks, baby sharks, caught on a boat deck in southern Georgia just a week ago. And, it was painful watching those animals thrashing around, such beautifully graceful, streamlined creatures who are moved so effectively in the water. They brought onto land, this foreign environment, they're helpless. They can't get themselves back into the water, especially not when they're on the end of a line. And so they can suffer physical injuries from that. And then the loss of the slimy mucus layer, particularly on bony fishes, that's a very protective layer on the outside of the scales. And the handling can cause a lot of that to be lost, and that causes the fish to be at risk of invasion by fungal infections and other parasites and that sort of thing. And there was actually a study that I cited in my book where they actually kept fishes in sea cages for a few days after capture and handling, and found that rates of skin infection and mortality were higher when they'd been handled than if they hadn't.
Right. So getting just because they're being released doesn't mean they're going to live as long as they might have before because of the stress and the handling.
Germany actually has outlawed catch and release fishing.
Wow.
You can only fish if you keep the fish, and the rationale for that is not quite the same, as because they're concerned about the health effects on the fish, but it's more like a moral argument that if you're only catching it for recreation, that doesn't justify causing the pain and suffering. If you're catching it for sustenance to eat, then they allow that.
Right. And so then we get into a whole other discussion about do you need to eat animals, which both of us have been vegan for decades, so kind of a lot of times you don't need to eat animals. Well, we're running short on time, but what are some things that people can do as consumers and citizens to help aquatic animals and ocean life?
Well, number one, the overarching thing that anyone can do, and I recommend, is simply to stop eating them. Whenever we eat a product, we buy it typically at the store, and when we buy it, we essentially are funding whatever practices went into getting it there. So it's immediately effective if people simply stop funding these industries. So that's job number one for anyone to do. If somebody's absolutely dedicated to fishing, my brother, for instance, he is an avid fisherman, doesn't want to stop. I always encourage people to use barbless hooks, so that at least can cause less damage to the fish. But there's still a number of other problems with that. Join Fish Feel is a group that does fish welfare work and fish protection.
Fish Feel.
Yeah, they have a Facebook page and they're active online. That's an excellent group that I recommend people join. And, you can do beach cleanups. You can remove plastic from the
Yeah.
oceans. I do that when I snorkel on the beach in South Florida. There's a number of things you can do with local activist groups and meetups and that sort of thing. Or you can always form your own group and write letters to the editor. When people
Yeah.
show disrespect for fish, I had an email from a reader this
Yeah.
week who wrote a letter to the editor. That's an effective way to have your voice heard.
Yeah.
We need to recognize these are, and I've been completely convinced of this. I didn't believe it when I started working on my book, but I'm now convinced that fishes are the equals of mammals and birds and all other vertebrates. They are absolutely just as complex and vulnerable, and we need to treat them with just as much respect and compassion.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic lesson for us. And just very quickly, what is your next book project? Are you working on some different
I'm working
animals?
on a book on insects, in particular flies, a very
Yeah.
underappreciated, kind of reviled group of animals. I like taking on challenges
from
with the
fishes
animals that
to
I write
flies.
about.
Yeah.
Yes, so that's a challenging one, but they do some amazing things. So it's
Yeah.
really fun to research and write this book, and there's a lot of cool stories that can emerge from that
Yeah.
too.
Well, Dr. Jonathan Balcombe, thanks for joining us here in the WRFG studio to help us understand how to protect fishes and their habitats and the harms caused by fishing practices. We'll have you back in the future to tell us about the lives of flies and their ecological importance.
Great, thank you.
This is Carrie Freeman wrapping up In Tune to Nature. Have you ever been watching a movie or a news story and thought they were sending the wrong message about fellow animals and how we should view them or treat them? Or maybe they're just ignoring animals completely as if the planet is solely filled with humans and we're the only ones with any stories? Even though we share the planet with trillions of other animals, well, as a media scholar, I think it's a good idea for us media consumers to share our constructive feedback with media makers to let them know we care about how fellow animals are represented in media, and we don't want to see messages that make us feel threatened by certain animals or dismissive of animal interests or selfishly view them as mere objects for our use and consumption, instead of seeing them as the feeling, thinking individuals they are. If you're writing to a media maker on their social media page or via the contact form on their website, you could reference the media guidelines at animalsandmedia.org. They were co-authored by myself and Professor Dr. Deborah Merskin. And you can use those to help you bolster your argument in your letter and provide the media maker with a list of constructive ideas for more respectful and accurate coverage of fellow animals and the natural world we share. The media are a powerful cultural force shaping our beliefs, attitudes, social norms, and policies. So I think it's worth giving media makers in journalism, advertising, film, and TV guidelines for respectful representation of other species by sharing the animalsandmedia.org website with them. And if you want an open access journalism outlet that is already practicing animal inclusive journalism, there is sentientmedia.org. That's spelled SENTIENT media.org. Thanks for speaking up and speaking out for those who can't.